So we're going to start with the next lecture portion, if I can get it up and going here. We're going to talk about urbanization and politics. Now, this is not politics in the sense of national politics. You can see that this is primarily going to be the urbanization and the impact of immigration on cities, the wealth gap and social classes, and about city politics in general, not as opposed to being something that's about the national politics, because that will be a separate lecture. If I can make this thing go, why is it not functioning like it's supposed to? There we go. If you'll notice, this picture right here is of your typical Gilded Age city street. Notice it looks crowded. Notice we've got lots of horses, and we've got food, and all of this is happening all in one place. Notice also the size of the buildings. This is very typical for what this kind of city environment would have looked like. The new city of the Gilded Age is a result of industrialization, and this opportunity from jobs, this opportunity for freedom from persecution and that kind of thing. And we have this huge tripling of the population in the cities. Prior to the Civil War, most places were rural. After the Civil War, we've got lots of people living in the cities. And that's because this efficient production needs your workers to be close by. You don't want your workers to have to travel in. This is not seasonal work. This is day in, day out, grinding it out kind of labor. And you need your workers to be close. And so this is where you begin to have this kind of sphere of influence, where you're going to have the inner city sphere. That's where everything is very close. And then you're going to have that middle ring where your professionals and your middle class are going to live, where they're not living right next to the dirt and the grime and the smoke of the factory, but they're close enough that they can travel in to manage or to take care of the working classes. And then you're going to have the outer sphere, which is where the wealthiest individuals are. And the wealthy individuals typically don't have to interact with that inner city ring, with that area that's close to the factories. So part of what we talk about with the Gilded Age is how the wealthy are very much unaware of what it's like to be working class in the United States, working class in the cities, whereas the middle class are far more aware of that because they have to interact on a daily basis, either as managers or supervisors, accountants, doctors, lawyers, teachers, any of those kinds of things. So you're going to see that this kind of dominates how cities are developed. So this idea of, and we don't really have full-fledged suburbs in the Gilded Age the way we'll see them developing in the 1950s or the way we see them now, because transportation is one of the issues. I mean, you have some transportation with you'll have some trolley cars or some horse-drawn kind of bus type things that travel around, and individuals would have horses and carriages and that kind of thing. But by and large, most people are going to get around on foot, and so you're not going to have mass transportation in the way that we see today. So just kind of keep that in mind, that you've got this development of the city, and that within that inner ring is where you're going to have the tenement buildings and the conditions that are difficult and dirty and that kind of thing. And it's going to be that middle class that's still in the city, but they're a little bit removed from it. And this will set us up for kind of the conflict over city politics. You have certain cities that dominate certain regions, Chicago in the Midwest, New York on the East Coast, Dallas or Houston in the South, San Francisco on the West Coast. Sorry, yawning. So we see all of that. And the cities typically is where you're going to notice the change in technology, the conveniences and that kind of thing, the gas lighting, indoor plumbing, which is, kind of a big thing. Sewer systems that's a big thing in the late 1800s. A lot of cities like Chicago didn't have that kind of infrastructure, thanks to the Chicago fire. Kind of fun in a sarcastic way or ironic way. Thanks to the Chicago fire, you have Chicago having to rebuild, and when they rebuild, they create a state-of-the-art sewage system. So these kinds of problems that we take for granted with sewers and water and toilets and streets and rules about who can keep what kind of animals where. This is all the product of the Gilded Age and how the cities developed and how crowded they became very quickly. This is where we talk about the rings of development reflecting social class and status. All of this is going to vary on with public transportation. The industrial area, that's where the company housing is going to be, or the low-cost tenements that we'll read about in class with Jacob Rees, keeping the workers close to the factories. Middle class are going to be a little bit away, and the mansions that the wealthy have are going to be completely removed. And the wealthy will only come into the cities for very specific purposes. This is a classic Jacob Rees picture that shows you what tenements look like. So when we do that reading, or if you think about that reading, you can see that. Sorry, yawning again. Bridges and skyscrapers. Cities grow along the rivers and harbors, naturally, going all the way back to the colonial period. But because mass transportation is limited, there's this need to have to build up instead of out. Because at some point your city is so big, I mean, you have urban sprawl, right? We have urban sprawl now where, I guess you don't think too much about having to drive 45 or 50 minutes, but anything over an hour feels like it's a little bit too far to drive, right? Well, take that, same thing's going to apply in 1880, but with horse-drawn carriages, how far an hour is, that's going to be a lot closer, right? You're talking 20 miles instead of, 50 or 60. So that's kind of what we're talking about with having to build up. And steel makes this possible. So you have skyscrapers, you're going to have things like suspension bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge, for example, that are going to connect the boroughs of New York City. So that's going to allow for kind of an increase in urbanization. And again, there's way more about that if you're kind of an architecture person. That this is just kind of the very basic essential facts about it. But in any given city where you have skyscrapers and bridges, there's going to be a period where this period is influential. This is the Flatiron Building, one of the first major skyscrapers in New York. We have slums, mostly inhabited by immigrants and rural migrants. These people that came looking for the labor jobs, the factory jobs. They're very crowded, cramped. There's not a lot of sanitation. And so we don't have the city services in place that we take for granted now. This allows for an increase in disease, typhoid, cholera, that kind of thing. High crime rates with pickpockets, prostitution. You've got lots of red light districts. In fact, one of the things of the progressive era, and one of the things that really galvanizes middle class women, is trying to do something about crime and prostitution. The view that if they can clean up the cities, that the men won't have any place to go for that kind of thing. So you've got that. And you're going to see over the course of the Gilded Age, there's going to be some attempts at creating codes to kind of enforce better buildings. But these often get twisted just like they do now. One of the famous ones was the dumbbell tenement, where they were supposed to have a certain number of windows in every apartment. And so the way that the landlords would cut costs would be to cut a window in a non-load-bearing wall, which means it's not on the outside, right? It's on the inside. So it's cheap. It's easy to put a window in. And it doesn't have to hold any weight or anything like that. So you would have these apartments that have this kind of random sort of window in the kitchen that goes into the living room. And you would think, well, that makes no sense. Well, it's because they were following the codes, but not really applying the codes in the way they were intended. We have a lot of fire hazards. These buildings are made out of wood, hence the Chicago fire. You don't really have organized fire departments until really the beginning of the 20th century. And, it's mostly gang-oriented. If you've ever watched Far and Away, there's a pretty good description of what that is. There's also, if you go to tenement.org, there's a website that takes you through a number of different tenements and how they looked. And you can see, where the windows are and that kind of thing. So that's tenement, tenement.org, if you're interested. This is another Jacob Rees picture called, I think it's Robbers Alley is the title of it. And this kind of shows you what your classic tenement neighborhood would have looked like. If you were a part of that neighborhood, you were good. If you weren't a part of that neighborhood, that was pretty scary. And even then, if you were a part of that neighborhood, if you did not satisfy the people in charge, with money or by doing what they asked you to do, this is what you had to face. So this kind of shows you some of the crime. This map gives you an idea of the global migration. Notice that we do have Chinese immigration coming in, really until 1882 when the Chinese Exclusion Act halts that. You've got lots of European immigration from Western Europe coming in, and then you're going to start to see some Italian immigration as well. So kind of notice these trends because I think that it's very important to distinguish between early immigration and later immigration. 14 million European immigrants. Most of them stay in the U.S. There are some that come here and then go back home, but most, by and large, end up staying here and setting up shop. And I think I've talked about this before, about the push factors and the pull factors. You'll want to be sure that you kind of understand how that works. And also understand that in the 1860s and 1870s, there's very few restrictions on immigration. It's not until you get to the 1880s and then later into the 20th century, as we talked about with the Larson book, that you begin to see immigration restrictions coming in. So just kind of know what that is. You can see here how immigration swells the workforce. Northern and Western Europe dominates in the 1870s and 1880s, but notice the trend in 1890. Of Southern and Eastern Europe. This is going to be Italy, Greece, Turkey, those kind of Mediterranean areas. And this trend will continue into the 20th century. Notice the decrease in Asian immigration as well, and the decrease in North American immigration. A lot of this has to do, I think, with, the lack of agricultural jobs, truthfully. But it's just kind of fascinating to see that. Ellis Island. This is the point of entry on the East Coast coming through New York. Medical exams to clear people. And, of course, often they had quarantines and that kind of thing. And what they're looking for are people that will be good workers. They don't want sick people. They don't want mentally disabled people. If you're coming into the country, you're coming into the country to add to our workforce. So they're going to do these medical exams to make sure that you're going to contribute to that. And then once these people get processed, they will then move into other cities, depending on their ethnicity, how many family members they've had here. My great-grandfather, he came over from Wales in the late 1800s, and that was kind of his experience. He came over, and then after going through the processing, he moved to Ohio and got involved with a large Welsh community there, and then married into another family that was more established and all that. And there you go. And then I came. So we've got pictures here of showing Ellis Island. These are the ferries that would take people from Ellis Island to New York City proper. This shows you kind of the waiting area, the processing area. Looks a lot like a cattle barn. They would sometimes quarantine people for a period of time, and they would put them in these little apartments until they got cleared. And then this shows some people traveling by wagon. These are more people. I think this picture are people that are waiting to be deported, actually, that did not clear processing. Here's some more pictures. This one, more kids waiting to be processed. This guy is having his eyebrows checked for lice. So it's kind of it's a challenging experience. Any of my movie buffs out there that are familiar with Godfather 2, that scene talks about that as well.